The camera never lies, except when it shows you things you never photographed. I'm Detective Lisa Hammond, forensic photographer for the King County Sheriff's Office, and I've been documenting crime scenes for 8 years. I've shot everything from domestic disputes to gang murders, always maintaining the same methodical approach. Arrive, assess, photograph, catalog, leave. The work requires emotional distance. You can't let yourself feel for the victims, or you'll burn out in 6 months. I learned that lesson early, watching senior photographers crack under the weight of what they'd seen through their viewfinders. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in October of 2024. A burglary at a vacation cabin near Lake Crescent in Olympic National Park. The owner, a Seattle tech executive named Marcus Webb, had arrived for a weekend getaway to find his front door hanging open and the interior ransacked. Local park rangers had secured the scene and called us in standard procedure for any crime on federal land that crossed into our jurisdiction. I loaded my equipment into the department SUV, 2 digital cameras, backup memory cards, tripod, measuring tape, evidence markers. The drive out to the peninsula took 90 minutes through increasingly dense forest. Fall rain drummed against the windshield as I navigated the winding park roads, passing towering Douglas firs that disappeared into gray mist above. The cabin sat in a clearing, about 50 yards from the lake shore, connected to the main road by a gravel drive that crunched under my tires. Ranger Patricia Moss met me at the perimeter tape she'd strung between the trees. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested this was her first major incident. Owner says nothing obvious was taken, she told me as we walked toward the structure. Television's still there, laptop was untouched, but someone definitely went through everything. The cabin was modest single-story, cedar shingle siding weathered gray by Pacific Northwest rains. The front door hung at an odd angle, one hinge torn completely from the frame. I noted the splintered wood around the lock, the way the door had been forced inward with considerable violence. Inside, the scene told a clear story of systematic searching. Couch cushions had been pulled off and examined. Kitchen drawers hung open, their contents scattered across linoleum flooring. In the bedroom, dresser drawers had been emptied and clothing thrown about, seemingly at random. But Ranger Moss was right. Nothing valuable appeared to be missing. I began my documentation process at the entry point, photographing the damaged door from multiple angles. The broken window in the living room came next, a spider web of cracks radiating from a central impact point, with glass fragments scattered both inside and outside the cabin. I shot 31 photographs total, marking each location with numbered evidence markers and recording the details in my scene log. The work was routine, mechanical. I'd photographed hundreds of similar scenes, break-ins, ransacking, property damage. They all followed predictable patterns. Perpetrators looked for cash, jewelry, electronics. They made noise, left traces, acted on impulse rather than planning. But as I packed my equipment back into the SUV, something nagged at me. The scene had felt wrong somehow, though I couldn't articulate why. The searching seemed too thorough, too methodical for a typical burglary, and there had been something about the broken glass pattern that didn't match the supposed point of entry. Back at the station, I connected my camera to the computer and began uploading the crime scene photos. The progress bar showed 247 files transferring. I stared at the screen, certain I'd made an error. I'd taken 31 photographs. I'd recorded each one meticulously in my scene log. I opened the image folder. 247 files, all time-stamped from today's scene documentation. But as I scrolled through them, my hands began to shake. The first 31 images were mine. I recognized each shot, each angle, each evidence marker placement. But then came photographs I'd never taken. The same broken window, but from impossible vantage points. Shots looking down from the cabin's rafters, though I'd never climbed up there. Close-ups of glass fragments I'd never examined. wide shots of the living room from corners where I'd never stood. I called Ranger Moss, asking if anyone else had photographed the scene before my arrival. She confirmed that no one had. The owner hadn't been inside since discovering the break-in. No other law enforcement had responded. The images continued. Photos of the ransacked bedroom from angles that would have required crawling under the bed. Pictures of scattered kitchen items taken from inside the open drawers themselves. And then something that made my blood go cold. Photographs of evidence markers in positions I'd never placed them, numbered with a sequence I'd never used. I scrolled faster, increasingly desperate to find some explanation. The timestamps were all correct, all showing today's date and times that corresponded to my presence at the scene. But the photos showed details I'd never documented, perspectives I'd never captured. And then I reached the end of the sequence, and everything changed. The final dozen images showed the cabin as I'd never seen it, furniture upright, windows intact, everything in perfect order. I watched in horror as I scrolled backward through what could only be described as the crime happening in reverse. Clothing flying from the floor back into dresser drawers. Broken glass reassembling itself into a complete window. The damaged door swinging shut, its hinges magically repairing. But these weren't different photographs. They were the exact same compositions as my crime scene documentation, showing the identical angles and perspectives, but with time flowing backward, as if someone had been standing exactly where I'd stood, at the exact moments I'd been there, photographing the scene as it undid itself. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate the mouse. I scrolled through the sequence again, watching the crime unreel itself in reverse chronological order. The final image showed the cabin in pristine condition, completely undisturbed, as if the break-in had never occurred at all. I checked the camera's internal memory, hoping to find some explanation, maybe a malfunction, corrupted data, anything rational. But the memory card showed exactly what the computer displayed. 247 photographs, all with metadata confirming they'd been taken with my camera at the scene during the time I'd been present. I drove back to the cabin that evening, telling myself I needed to verify something, to compare what I'd seen with what the photographs showed. The sun was setting through the forest canopy as I parked in the same spot I'd occupied that morning. The cabin looked exactly as I'd left it. Damaged door hanging askew, broken window. But as I approached the entrance, I noticed something that stopped me cold. There were footprints in the soft earth beside the cabin. 2 sets, one pair that matched my boots from the morning documentation, and another set that followed the exact same path but appeared to have been made while walking backward, as if someone had traced my movements in reverse, placing their feet in the precise locations where I'd stepped, but facing the opposite direction. I didn't go inside. I drove back to town and submitted my initial report, documenting only the 31 photographs I'd intentionally taken. I buried the other 216 images in a password-protected folder on my personal drive, telling myself I'd figure out a rational explanation eventually. 3 weeks later, Marcus Webb called the department. His cabin had been broken into again, he said. Same MO, same ransacking pattern. When I arrived to document the second scene, I found something that made me want to transfer to a different department entirely. The cabin was in perfect condition. No broken window, no damaged door, no evidence that any break-in had ever occurred. According to Webb, he'd never made the call. I still have those photographs on my computer. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I scroll through them, watching that crime happen in reverse, wondering who was standing behind me at that scene, documenting my documentation, capturing moments I never lived through. The camera never lies, but sometimes it sees things we were never meant to record. I've started checking my memory cards more carefully now. Every scene, every call. So far, I've only found the photographs I remember taking. But I keep expecting to find more images, more impossible perspectives, more evidence that something is always watching through my lens, recording things that haven't happened yet, or undoing things that already have. The worst part is knowing that somewhere out there, In some folder on some computer, there might be photographs of me that I never posed for, taken by someone who was never really there. Sometimes the camera captures accidents that haven't happened yet. I'm Sergeant Paul Novak, forensic photographer for the Utah Highway Patrol, stationed out of West Desert. I've been documenting traffic fatalities for 11 years, and I've learned that every accident tells a story. Tire marks reveal speed and direction. Debris patterns show point of impact. Vehicle damage indicates the sequence of events. The physics never lie, even when witnesses do. My job is to read the evidence scattered across asphalt and reconstruct the final moments of someone's life with mathematical precision. The call came in just after dawn on November 15, 2024. Single vehicle fatality on Route 50, approximately 12 miles east of the Bonneville Salt Flats. A trucker heading west had spotted the body at first light and radioed it in. By the time I arrived, Trooper Angela Chen had already secured the scene with flares and tape, her patrol car's strobes cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. The victim lay face down on the westbound shoulder, approximately 30 feet from the roadway. Male, mid-40s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. No identification visible. His position suggested he'd been thrown a considerable distance, the kind of impact that occurs when a vehicle strikes a pedestrian at highway speeds. Looks like he was walking along the shoulder, Chen told me as I unloaded my equipment. Driver probably didn't see him in the dark, clipped him, and kept going. We've got a bolo out for vehicles with front-end damage, but you know how these hit and runs go. I nodded, setting up my camera and evidence markers. Route 50 through this section was arrow straight for miles in either direction, cutting across desert that stretched to mountain ranges on both horizons. During daylight hours, you could see for 20 miles, but at night, with no streetlights and minimal shoulder space, it became a death trap for anyone foolish enough to walk it. The scene appeared straightforward. I documented the victim's position with wide shots and close-ups, then began working outward in expanding circles. Standard protocol called for photographing all visible evidence before the body was moved: tire marks, debris, any indication of the vehicle's path and the point of impact. But as I examined the roadway more closely, something felt wrong. The asphalt showed no skid marks, no tire impressions in the gravel shoulder where a vehicle might have veered off course. I walked the area twice, looking for broken glass, plastic fragments, or paint transfer, anything that might have come from the striking vehicle. Nothing. "Chen," I called out, "you see any debris from the car that hit him?" She walked over, scanning the ground with her flashlight. Nothing obvious, but the impact might have carried everything forward with the vehicle. I photographed the area anyway, marking potential evidence locations even though I couldn't see any actual evidence. The victim's injuries were consistent with vehicular impact, but the scene told no story about what had struck him or where the collision had occurred. As the sun climbed higher, I expanded my search radius. The desert beside Route 50 stretched endlessly in both directions. White salt and alkali flats, broken only by occasional sagebrush and scattered rocks. No place for a damaged vehicle to hide. No side roads where a driver might have pulled off to assess damage. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, reviewing my photos on the camera's LCD screen. "Where's the evidence?" Chen was interviewing the trucker who'd found the body, getting his statement about the discovery. He'd been driving this route for 15 years, he said, and had never seen anything like it. The body hadn't been there when he'd passed eastbound 6 hours earlier, he was certain of that. I spent 3 hours documenting every inch of the scene: the victim's position, the roadway surface, the surrounding desert. By the time the coroner's van arrived to transport the body, I had 47 photographs that told the story of a hit-and-run accident with no evidence of the vehicle involved. Back at the station, I connected my camera to the computer and began processing the images. The first few photos looked exactly as I remembered: the victim lying on the shoulder, the empty roadway, the vast desert landscape. But as I scrolled through the sequence, my chest tightened. The roadway surface was wrong. In my photographs, Route 50 showed fresh asphalt with clear yellow center lines and white shoulder markers. But the images on my computer screen showed cracked pavement with faded markings, sections where the asphalt had given way to gravel patches. Tire marks scored the surface in multiple directions, fresh rubber burns that definitely hadn't been there during my documentation. I opened the next image. The victim lay in the identical position, but now debris was scattered around the impact area. Broken headlight glass caught the morning Sunday. Fragments of red plastic that looked like taillight pieces. A chrome bumper section that had been torn away during the collision. My hands shook as I scrolled to the next photograph. Same victim, same exact positioning, but now the skid marks showed a different pattern entirely. These weren't the straight-line marks of a vehicle that had clipped a pedestrian and continued forward. These were the desperate serpentine tracks of a driver who had seen the victim at the last second and tried to avoid the collision. I checked the photo metadata, all taken with my camera, all time-stamped from this morning's scene documentation. But they showed evidence that simply hadn't existed when I'd been there. The sequence continued. Each image showed the identical victim in the identical position, but the surrounding crash scene changed from photo to photo. Different tire marks, different debris patterns, different damage to the roadway itself. It was as if someone had been photographing multiple accidents that had all resulted in the exact same fatality. In one image, the asphalt showed burn marks from a vehicle fire. In another, there were gouges in the pavement where something heavy had been dragged. A few photos showed skid marks that curved off the roadway entirely, disappearing into the desert sand where no vehicle tracks existed. But the victim never moved. In every photograph, he lay in precisely the same position, his body arranged identically down to the angle of his limbs and the way his clothing had settled. Only the evidence around him changed, telling different stories about how he'd died. I drove back to the scene that afternoon, telling myself there had to be a technical explanation. Camera malfunction, corrupted memory card, something rational. But as I walked the shoulder where the body had been found, I discovered something that made my blood freeze. There were tire marks in the asphalt, fresh rubber burns that definitely hadn't been there during my morning documentation. Not just one set, but multiple overlapping patterns, as if several different vehicles had skidded through this exact location at different times. I knelt beside the marks, running my fingers along the scorched rubber. They were real, physical evidence that hadn't existed 6 hours earlier. But according to Chen's report, no other vehicles had been at the scene since the body's removal. I set up my camera and began photographing the new evidence. But as I reviewed each image on the LCD screen, I saw something that sent me stumbling backward across the desert hardpan. In every photograph, standing just beyond the frame's edge, I could see the shadow of another photographer, someone else documenting the scene from angles that mirrored my own positions. The shadow moved as I moved, stayed exactly parallel to my movements, but remained just outside the camera's field of view. I spun around, scanning the empty desert in all directions. Nothing. No other vehicles, no other people. Just endless salt flats stretching to the horizon under the afternoon Sunday. But when I looked back at the camera's screen, the shadow was still there in every image. And now I could see something else. A second set of evidence markers, placed precisely where mine had been, numbered with the exact same sequence I was using. I deleted the photos and drove away, leaving the tire marks and the impossible evidence for someone else to find. Back at the station, I filed a standard report documenting a hit-and-run fatality with no recoverable evidence. I never mentioned the photographs that had shown different accidents or the tire marks that had appeared after I'd left the scene. The victim was eventually identified through dental records as Thomas Kellerman, a drifter who'd been walking the highways for years. The case remains open, though no one expects it to be solved. Hit and runs in the desert rarely are. I still have those photographs on my computer, buried in a folder I never opened. 47 images of the same victim dying in different ways, surrounded by evidence from accidents that might have happened or could still happen, or are happening right now on some version of Route 50 that exists parallel to ours. Sometimes I wonder if somewhere out there, another forensic photographer is processing images from that morning, seeing the scene as I actually documented it, while their camera shows them something entirely different. I wonder if they're also finding tire marks that weren't there before, also seeing shadows of photographers who shouldn't exist. The desert keeps its own records, written in tire rubber and broken glass, and the endless repetition of the same accident happening different ways. My job is supposed to be reading those records, but I've learned that some stories are written in languages we were never meant to understand. Film doesn't lie, but sometimes it shows you fires that burned in different timelines. I'm Officer Catherine Mills, crime scene photographer for the Cochise County Sheriff's Office. I've been documenting incidents in southeastern Arizona for 6 years, covering everything from domestic disturbances in Tombstone to drug busts along the border. The work requires precision and attention to detail. Every photograph must be admissible in court, every angle carefully considered. I still use film for most of my documentation, despite pressure from the department to go digital. There's something about the deliberate nature of film photography that forces you to think before you shoot, to really see what you're documenting. Bisbee is a strange place to work as a law enforcement photographer. The old copper mining town clings to hillsides like a collection of discarded toys, its Victorian houses painted in colors that seem to shift depending on the light. The abandoned mines that honeycomb the mountains around town create their own problems. Teenagers exploring tunnels, transients seeking shelter, the occasional accident when someone falls down a shaft that's been hidden by decades of brush growth. The call came in on a Thursday evening in March of 2024. Suspected arson at the old Copper Queen mine complex, about 3 miles south of town. A hiker had reported seeing smoke rising from one of the abandoned processing buildings and called it in to the fire department. By the time firefighters arrived, whatever had been burning had mostly extinguished itself, leaving behind the acrid smell of charred wood and melted plastic. Fire Chief Rodriguez met me at the access road leading up to the mine site. His crew had already knocked down the remaining hotspots and ventilated the building, but he wanted everything documented before they began their investigation into the cause. "Looks like someone was camping in there," he told me as we climbed the rocky path toward the burned structure. "We found sleeping bags, food containers, drug paraphernalia. Probably started when they knocked over a camp stove or something." The building had been part of the mine's original ore processing operation, built sometime in the 1920s when Bisbee was still a major copper producer. Most of the roof had long since collapsed, leaving the interior open to the elements. But someone had created a crude shelter in one corner using tarps and salvaged materials, and that's where the fire had started. I loaded a fresh roll of 36 exposure black and white film into my camera, Kodak Tri-X, the same stock I'd been using for years. Digital might be faster and more convenient, but film captures details that sensors miss, especially in challenging lighting conditions like fire scenes, where extreme contrasts between light and shadow can fool electronic meters. The burned area covered roughly 12 feet by 8 feet in the building's northeast corner. Charred sleeping bags and melted camping gear were scattered across the concrete floor. The wooden supports that had held up the makeshift shelter were reduced to carbonized stumps. Smoke stains on the remaining walls showed the fire's progression. It had burned hot and fast before running out of fuel. I began my systematic documentation, working from wide establishing shots to progressively tighter detail photos. The damaged camping equipment, the burn patterns on the concrete, the smoke residue that marked the fire's path. Standard procedure called for 36 photographs minimum at any fire scene, and I used every frame on the roll, shooting from multiple angles to ensure complete coverage. The work was routine, methodical. I documented dozens of similar scenes, transient camps that had burned due to carelessness or accident. The only unusual aspect was the location. Most homeless individuals avoided the old mine sites, preferring abandoned buildings in town where they could access water and stay closer to services. As I finished the last few frames, something caught my attention in the viewfinder. In the corner where the fire had burned hottest, I could see what looked like additional burn patterns that I hadn't noticed during my initial survey. Darker areas on the concrete that suggested the fire had burned much longer than Chief Rodriguez had estimated. I advanced the film to the final frame and took one last wide shot of the entire scene. The camera's advance lever clicked to a stop, indicating the roll was completely exposed. 36 frames, all accounted for. Back at the station, I developed the film in the darkroom I'd set up in the basement. Working in the red-lit safety of the developer chemistry, I could see the images taking shape on the negatives as they moved through the process. The first few frames looked exactly as I remembered wide shots of the burned area, establishing the scene's context within the abandoned building. But as I examined the negative strip more closely, I realized something was wrong. The strip of film was longer than it should have been. A standard 36 exposure roll produces approximately 5 feet of negative. This strip was nearly 12 feet long. I counted the frames under the enlarger's light. 89 images. 89 photographs on a roll of film that should have contained 36. I started printing contact sheets, telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the film manufacturer had made an error, loading more film than normal onto the spool. Maybe my camera's advanced mechanism was malfunctioning, exposing overlapping frames. But as the prints emerged in the developer, I saw that each frame was complete and properly exposed. No overlaps, no double exposures, no technical errors. Just 89 distinct photographs of the arson scene. The first 36 images were mine. I recognized each composition, each angle I'd chosen, but frames 37 through 89 showed the same scene with subtle but disturbing differences. In frame 37, the burn patterns on the concrete were more extensive, suggesting the fire had burned much longer than we'd estimated. Frame 38 showed charred debris that I hadn't seen at the scene, pieces of furniture, personal belongings that hadn't been part of the transient camp. I continued printing, my hands growing unsteady as each new image revealed additional differences. The camping gear was arranged differently. The smoke stains on the walls followed different patterns. The burn damage to the wooden supports showed varying degrees of destruction. But it was frame 53 that made me step away from the enlarger entirely. The photograph showed a body. A human figure lay in the center of the burned area, surrounded by the charred remains of the makeshift shelter. The body was completely carbonized, reduced to the skeletal remains typical of victims who die in intense fires. But this victim hadn't been at the scene when I documented it. Chief Rodriguez's crew had searched the entire building before declaring it safe for investigation. I printed the remaining frames with shaking hands. Frame 54 showed the same body from a different angle. Frame 55 revealed additional victims, 3 more burned corpses arranged around the camping area like they'd been sleeping when the fire started. The final dozen frames showed the scene as a mass casualty event. Bodies everywhere. Some still recognizable as human, others reduced to ash and bone fragments. Personal effects scattered throughout the burned area, wallets, jewelry, clothing that had somehow survived the flames. Evidence of multiple people who had died in a fire that had consumed far more than camping equipment. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the presence of the bodies. It was their positioning. Each victim lay in precisely the locations where I'd placed my evidence markers during the documentation. As if they'd been arranged to match the geometry of my photograph sequence, I locked the prints in my desk drawer and drove back to the mine site that night, telling myself I needed to verify what I'd seen. The moon was nearly full, casting stark shadows across the desert landscape as I climbed the access road with my flashlight. The building looked exactly as we'd left it. No bodies, no additional evidence, no sign that anyone had died in the fire. But as I examined the burned area more closely, I found something that made my chest tighten. There were additional burn patterns in the concrete, deeper, more extensive damage that definitely hadn't been there during my afternoon documentation. And in the center of the area, embedded in the concrete itself, was a partial handprint, as if someone had pressed their hand against the floor while it was still hot enough to leave an impression. I photographed the handprint with my backup camera, using the flash to capture every detail. But when I had that roll developed the next morning, the image showed something impossible. The handprint in my photograph had 5 fingers. The one I'd seen at the scene had 6. I never submitted the extra 53 photographs as evidence. The fire was ruled accidental, caused by a camp stove that had been knocked over in the abandoned building. No victims were found, no missing persons reports filed. Chief Rodriguez closed the case within a week, but I kept those prints, hidden in a safety deposit box at the bank. Sometimes I take them out and study them, trying to understand how a 36 exposure roll of film captured 89 photographs of people dying in a fire that never killed anyone. The worst part is knowing that somewhere in those mountains around Bisbee, there might be other mine sites where different versions of that fire are still burning. Places where the victims I photographed are still dying, over and over, in flames that consume everything except the film that documents their deaths. I've started using digital cameras exclusively now. The department was right. It's more efficient, more reliable. But sometimes I wonder if film sees things that digital sensors can't or won't. Things that happen in the spaces between one frame and the next, in the chemical reactions that turn light into permanent images. Film remembers everything, even the things that never happened. Digital cameras don't make mistakes about when photographs were taken, except when they document searches that happened before you were born. I'm Detective Raymond Cross, crime scene analyst for the Jackson County Sheriff's Office in Southern Oregon. I was born in 2023, which makes me 25 years old and relatively new to law enforcement photography. I've been documenting crime scenes and missing person searches for 18 months, ever since I graduated from the police academy and specialized in forensic photography. The work suits my methodical nature. Every image must be precisely documented, every angle carefully considered, every piece of evidence captured with technical accuracy that will hold up in court. Crater Lake sits in the collapsed caldera of an ancient volcano. Its impossibly blue water surrounded by cliffs that drop nearly 2,000 feet to the surface. The area presents unique challenges for search and rescue operations, limited access points, extreme weather conditions, and terrain that can be treacherous, even for experienced hikers. During my brief tenure with the department, I'd photographed 3 previous missing person searches in the park, all of which had ended with successful recoveries. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in September of 2024. A 23-year-old backpacker named Jennifer Walsh had failed to check in with her family after a planned solo hike around the Rim Trail. Her car was found in the Rim Village parking area, but she hadn't been seen since Sunday evening. Park rangers had organized a search grid covering the most likely areas where someone might become lost or injured. I drove up to the park with my equipment, 2 digital cameras, backup batteries, GPS unit, and evidence documentation kit. The autumn weather was typical for the elevation. Clear skies with temperatures in the 40s, patches of early snow in the shaded areas. Search Coordinator Ranger Mike Stevens briefed me on the search plan as volunteers and rescue personnel assembled near the visitor center. We're focusing on the section between Watchman Peak and the Phantom Ship Overlook, Stevens told me. The trail there gets tricky in low light. Lots of places where someone could miss a turn and end up off the main path. The search team spread out across the assigned grid, using handheld radios to maintain communication. My job was to document any evidence we found: footprints, discarded items, areas where someone might have camped or rested. Standard protocol called for photographing everything in context before it was disturbed, creating a visual record that could be analyzed later if the search extended beyond the initial day. For the first 3 hours, we found nothing. The rim trail showed signs of regular foot traffic, but nothing that suggested someone had left the established path. I photographed several areas where search teams thought they'd spotted something: a piece of fabric caught on a branch that turned out to be trash, footprints in soft earth that belonged to other hikers. Then, around noon, one of the search dogs alerted near a section of trail about half a mile east of the Phantom Ship overlook. The dog's handler called for me to document the area before they conducted a more detailed search. I found the team clustered around a small clearing just off the main trail, where the rimrock gave way to a gentler slope covered in lodgepole pine. The dog had indicated scent in this area, though no obvious evidence was visible to the human searchers. I began my systematic photography, working from wide establishing shots to progressively tighter detail images. The clearing showed signs of recent human presence: compressed vegetation where someone might have sat or rested, a small depression in the pine needles that could have been left by a backpack. As I worked, something felt wrong about the light. Despite the clear weather, my camera's meter readings were inconsistent, as if the available light was fluctuating in ways that didn't match the stable conditions I could see with my eyes. I adjusted my settings repeatedly, but the exposures remained unpredictable. "You getting anything?" asked Sarah Chen, one of the volunteer searchers who was watching me work. "Hard to say," I replied, reviewing the images on my camera's LCD screen. "Light's playing tricks on me today." But as I scrolled through the photos I'd just taken, I noticed something that made my hands freeze on the camera controls. The images looked different from what I remembered shooting. Instead of the clear autumn weather I was experiencing, the photos showed overcast skies with what appeared to be late spring snow covering much of the ground. I checked the camera settings, thinking I might have accidentally applied some kind of filter or processing preset. But the metadata showed everything was configured correctly: ISO, aperture, shutter speed, all exactly as I'd set them. The next image was even more disturbing. It showed the same clearing, but with different search equipment scattered around the area. Orange surveyor's tape marked evidence locations using a grid system my department had abandoned years before I joined. In the background, I could see search personnel wearing uniform styles that looked outdated, heavy wool jackets and equipment harnesses that predated modern search and rescue gear. I looked up from the camera screen to compare what I was seeing with the actual scene. The clearing looked exactly as it had all morning: autumn weather, modern search equipment, volunteers wearing contemporary outdoor gear. But my camera was documenting something entirely different. "Chen," I called out, "take a look at this." She walked over and examined the camera's LCD screen. Her expression shifted from curiosity to confusion as she scrolled through the images. "That's not what we look like," she said slowly. "And when did it snow?" I checked the timestamp on the problematic images: September 14th, 1994. The exact date we were conducting our search, but 30 years in the past. 29 years before I was born. We were joined by Ranger Stevens, who examined the photos with growing concern. The images clearly showed the same location we were searching, but documented with equipment and techniques his department had stopped using decades earlier. "This is impossible," he muttered, examining the timestamp data. "These photos show our old grid marking system. We switched to GPS coordinates in 2005. I continued photographing, hoping the camera malfunction would resolve itself. But every image showed the same temporal displacement, the exact search we were conducting, but documented as if it were happening in 1994. Then I reached the final images in the sequence, and everything changed. The last 6 photographs showed the discovery we hadn't made yet. In crystal clear detail, my camera had documented the location of Jennifer Walsh's body. She lay at the bottom of a steep ravine about 200 yards from our current position, partially concealed by fallen logs and autumn debris. The photos showed her exact position, the condition of her clothing, the way her backpack had become entangled in the undergrowth during her fall. But these images also bore the impossible timestamp September 14, 1994. According to my camera's metadata, Jennifer Walsh's body had been photographed 30 years before she was born. I showed the images to Ranger Stevens, who immediately radioed for the search teams to investigate the ravine location. 20 minutes later, they found her exactly where the photographs had indicated, positioned precisely as the images had shown. Jennifer Walsh had died from injuries sustained in a fall, probably within hours of her disappearance. The coroner estimated she'd been dead for approximately 48 hours, consistent with her last known sighting on Sunday evening. But according to my camera, her body had been photographed on the same date 30 years earlier, using equipment and techniques that had been obsolete since before digital photography existed. I never submitted those photographs as evidence. The official search documentation shows that Jennifer's body was discovered by search dogs and volunteer personnel, with no mention of the impossible images that had led us to her location. The camera worked normally for every assignment after that day. Perfect exposure, accurate timestamps, metadata that matched reality in every detail. I've had it checked by technical support twice, and they found no malfunctions or anomalies. But I kept those impossible photographs on a separate memory card, locked in my desk drawer. Sometimes I review them, studying the evidence that suggests Jennifer Walsh died twice, once in 2024, when her family reported her missing, and once in 1994, when someone with my exact equipment documented her death using search techniques that wouldn't be invented for another decade. The timestamp data is unalterable, embedded in the image files with cryptographic precision. Those photographs were taken on September 14, 1994, by a camera that wouldn't be manufactured until 2022, operated by someone who wouldn't be born until 2023. I've started to wonder if every missing person case leaves echoes in time, searches that repeat themselves across decades with different searchers finding the same evidence in the same locations. Maybe the mountains around Crater Lake keep their own records, documenting tragedies that happen over and over in slightly different ways. The worst part is knowing that somewhere in the archives, there might be photographs from 1994 showing search teams wearing modern equipment, looking for someone who wouldn't go missing for another 30 years. Time might be more fragile than we think, and cameras might see through cracks we didn't know existed. Cloud storage is supposed to preserve your files forever, but sometimes forever reaches further back than it should. I'm Lieutenant Maria Santos, forensic photographer for the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office in western South Dakota. I've been documenting crime scenes for 9 years, covering everything from domestic disturbances in lead to methamphetamine labs in the remote hills outside Deadwood. The Black Hills region presents unique challenges for law enforcement: abandoned mines, isolated cabins, terrain that makes surveillance and raids difficult. I've always prided myself on maintaining meticulous digital records, with every photograph backed up to multiple cloud storage systems to ensure evidence is never lost. Deadwood itself exists in a strange relationship with its past. The town built its identity around the 1870s gold rush era, preserving historic buildings and maintaining the illusion that Wild Bill Hickok might walk down Main Street at any moment. But beneath the tourist veneer, modern crime persists: drug trafficking, illegal gambling, the kind of law enforcement work that doesn't make it into the history books. The call came in on a Friday morning in October of 2024. DEA task force had identified a methamphetamine distribution operation running out of a house on Charles Street, just a few blocks from the historic district. The structure was a Victorian-era residence that had been converted into apartments, the kind of building that attracted transients and people who preferred to avoid official attention. I arrived at the staging area as the tactical team prepared for entry. The house sat on a hillside lot, its weathered clapboard siding and sagging front porch typical of Deadwood's older residential areas. Detective Frank Morrison briefed me on what they expected to find: large-scale drug packaging operation, possibly weapons, multiple suspects who had been under surveillance for several weeks. "We're going to need comprehensive documentation," Morrison told me as officers took their positions. "This one's going federal, so everything has to be by the book." The entry went smoothly. 4 suspects were arrested without resistance, and the search revealed exactly what the investigation had predicted: several pounds of methamphetamine in various stages of processing, packaging materials, scales, and a substantial amount of cash. My job was to document everything in place before evidence technicians began collection. I worked systematically through the house, photographing each room from multiple angles: the makeshift laboratory in the basement, the packaging operation spread across the kitchen table, individual evidence items tagged and numbered according to protocol. My camera automatically uploaded each image to the department's cloud storage system as I worked, ensuring real-time backup of all evidence photography. The work was routine, methodical. I documented dozens of similar scenes, drug houses that all looked essentially the same, with the same equipment, the same desperate improvisation, the same stale air that smelled of chemicals and neglect. But as I finished photographing the evidence in the main floor living room, I received a notification on my phone that made me pause. An email from the department's IT division informing me that my cloud storage account had exceeded its allocated space. According to the message, I'd uploaded over 10,000 files in the past hour. That was impossible. I'd taken maybe 60 photographs during the entire raid, and my cloud account had been nearly empty that morning. I opened the cloud storage app on my phone to check the file count. The interface showed 10,847 files uploaded today, all with timestamps from the current operation. But as I scrolled through the image previews, I saw something that made my hands shake. The photographs weren't all mine. Mixed in with my digital crime scene documentation were what appeared to be historical photographs, sepia-toned images that looked like they'd been taken in the 1800s. But these weren't random archival photos. They showed the exact same house I was currently documenting, the exact same rooms, but furnished with period-appropriate furniture and occupied by people wearing clothes from more than a century ago. I scrolled through more images, my confusion growing. The historical photographs showed the same basement where we'd found the meth lab, but instead of drug equipment, the space contained mining gear, pickaxes, ore buckets, equipment typical of Deadwood's gold rush era. The kitchen where suspects had been packaging drugs was shown with a cast iron stove and period furnishings. But the most disturbing aspect was the evidence documentation. Each historical photograph included proper evidence markers, numbered placards, and chain of custody information. The same systematic approach I used for modern crime scenes, but applied to investigations from the 1870s and 80s. I found Detective Morrison and showed him the cloud storage display on my phone. He examined the images with increasing bewilderment. "These look like crime scene photos," he said, studying a sepia image that showed evidence markers placed around what appeared to be a gambling operation in the house's front parlor. "But from when? 1876? I opened the file properties for one of the historical images. The metadata showed it had been uploaded from my camera account, with proper GPS coordinates for the Charles Street house. But the creation date was listed as March 23, 1877. More disturbing were the officer names listed in the chain of custody documentation. The historical photos were attributed to Deputy Marshal J. Henderson and Sheriff W. Bullock, names I recognized from Deadwood's history. Both men had been real law enforcement officers during the Gold Rush era, and both had died in the 1880s. I continued reviewing the cloud storage, trying to understand what was happening. For every contemporary photograph I'd taken of the drug bust, there was a corresponding historical image showing law enforcement activity in the same location. Different crimes, different time periods, but identical documentation techniques. The basement meth lab corresponded to a historical raid on an illegal mining operation. The kitchen packaging area matched an 1878 gambling bust. The bedroom where we'd found cash and weapons was documented as the site of an 1879 robbery investigation. "Morrison," I called out, my voice tighter than I intended. "We need to check something." I led him to the basement, where evidence technicians were still processing the drug lab. Using my phone's flashlight, I examined the stone foundation walls more closely. In several places, I could see older markings carved into the rock initials, dates, symbols that predated the house's construction. One carving caught my attention. J.H. Evidence Room, the 23rd of March 1877. The exact date and officer initial from the metadata on the historical photographs. Morrison ran his finger over the carving. "This is old, really old, but how would your camera know about it?" I didn't have an answer. I continued documenting the scene with my camera, but each new photograph triggered additional uploads to the cloud storage. For every image I took, 3 or 4 historical photos appeared in my account, all bearing evidence, documentation from investigations that had occurred more than a century ago. The final sequence of uploads showed something that made me want to leave Deadwood entirely. Among the historical crime scene photos, I found images of modern suspects. The 4 individuals we'd arrested that morning appeared in sepia-toned photographs, wearing period clothing but clearly recognizable as the same people. They were shown in the same house, in the same rooms, but engaged in 1870s-era criminal activities. But according to the metadata, these historical photos of contemporary suspects had been taken by Deputy Marshal Henderson in 1877, 47 years before the oldest suspect was born. I showed the images to Morrison, who stared at them in silence for several minutes. "This is them," he finally said. "These are definitely our suspects, but dressed like..." He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The cloud storage continued updating throughout the afternoon. By the time we finished processing the scene, my account contained over 15,000 files, a mixture of my contemporary crime scene documentation and historical photographs that should never have existed. That evening, I contacted the department's IT specialist, hoping for a technical explanation. System error, corrupted upload process, anything rational. But when we examined the cloud storage servers, we found something impossible. The historical photographs weren't recent uploads. According to the server logs, they'd been in my account since I'd first created it 9 years earlier. Every crime scene I'd ever documented in Deadwood had corresponding historical photos, all bearing evidence documentation from the 1870s and 80s. I'd been unknowingly sharing cloud storage space with dead law enforcement officers for nearly a decade. The drug bust case went to trial 6 months later. I testified about my crime scene documentation, but I never mentioned the historical photographs that had appeared alongside my evidence photos. The suspects were convicted based on the physical evidence we'd collected, not on images taken by officers who died before photography was invented. But I kept the historical photos, stored on a separate drive that's not connected to any cloud service. Sometimes I review them, comparing my modern documentation techniques to methods used by law enforcement officers more than a century ago. The approach is remarkably similar. The same systematic photography, the same evidence markers, the same chain of custody procedures. It's as if crime scene investigation follows patterns that transcend time, with each generation of officers unknowingly repeating the work of their predecessors. The cloud storage just made those connections visible, linking investigations across decades in ways that shouldn't be possible. I've started using local storage exclusively now, keeping my files on physical drives that can't upload to distant servers. But sometimes I wonder if other cloud storage accounts are filling up with files from the past, if every digital photograph we take is somehow connected to images that came before. The internet might be more haunted than we realize, with data that refuses to stay in its proper time period. Sometimes, photographs develop themselves when no one is watching, showing angles that shouldn't exist. I'm Detective Kevin Walsh, police photographer for the Imperial County Sheriff's Office in southeastern California. I've been documenting crime scenes for 7 years, working out of our substation in Calexico that serves the desert communities around the Salton Sea. The region presents unique challenges for law enforcement. Vast stretches of empty desert, abandoned settlements from failed agricultural projects, and the sea itself, a slowly evaporating inland lake that attracts both tourists and people who prefer to stay hidden from official attention. I'm one of the few officers in the department who still uses film for crime scene documentation. Most of my colleagues switched to digital years ago, but I prefer the deliberate nature of film photography, the way it forces you to think before pressing the shutter, to really see what you're documenting. Our substation has a small darkroom in the basement that I converted from a storage closet, complete with enlarger, chemical trays, and a drying line for prints. The call came in on a Wednesday afternoon in August of 2024. Body found near the north shore of the Salton Sea, approximately 2 miles from the ruins of Bombay Beach. A local fisherman had spotted what appeared to be human remains, partially buried in the salt-encrusted sand, and called it in to dispatch. The location was remote, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through tamarisk groves and abandoned trailer foundations. I arrived at the scene as Detective Angela Rodriguez was establishing the perimeter. The body lay about 50 yards from the water's edge, in an area where the retreating shoreline had left behind a flat expanse of crystallized salt and dried mud. The victim appeared to be male, middle-aged, wearing jeans and a cotton shirt that had been bleached and stiffened by exposure to the desert Sunday. "Looks like he's been here a while," Rodriguez told me as I unloaded my equipment. "Could be natural causes, heart attack, dehydration, something like that. But we need to document everything before the coroner takes him." The Salton Sea creates its own microenvironment of decay and preservation. The high salt content and extreme heat can mummify organic material while simultaneously corroding metal and fabric. Bodies found in this area often present challenges for determining cause and time of death. I loaded fresh film into my camera, Kodak Tri-X black and white, the same stock I'd been using for years. The harsh desert light required careful exposure calculations, but film handles extreme contrasts better than digital sensors, especially in conditions like these where the salt flats create blinding reflections. I began my systematic documentation, working from wide establishing shots to progressively tighter detail images. The victim's position, the surrounding terrain, any evidence that might indicate how he'd ended up in this remote location. His wallet was still in his back pocket, containing identification for Robert Chen, a 43-year-old from San Diego, with no obvious connection to the Salton Sea area. As I worked, something about the scene felt wrong, though I couldn't articulate exactly what. The body's position seemed too deliberate, too carefully arranged. Chen lay on his back with his arms at his sides, facing directly toward the sky. Most people who die of natural causes in the desert don't end up in such precise positioning. I shot 2 full rolls of film, 72 exposures total, documenting every aspect of the scene before the body was removed. The work was routine, methodical, the same systematic approach I'd used for hundreds of crime scenes over the years. Back at the substation, I developed the film in my darkroom that evening. Working in the red-lit safety of the chemical baths, I could see the images taking shape on the negatives as they moved through the developer. The exposures looked good, proper contrast, sharp focus, all the detail necessary for forensic analysis. I made contact sheets of both rolls, then selected 12 images for full-size prints that would be included in the case file. Standard 8x10 enlargements showing the scene from multiple angles with proper evidence markers and documentation. I hung the prints on the drying line and left them to process overnight. The next morning, I returned to the darkroom to collect the dried prints and found something that made me question my own memory. 27 photographs hung on the drying line. I had printed 12 images the night before. I was certain of that. I'd made notes in my processing log, recorded the paper count, documented everything according to department protocol, but 15 additional prints hung alongside my documentation, still slightly damp from the processing chemicals. The extra photographs showed the same crime scene I'd documented, but from angles I'd never shot, close-ups of evidence I hadn't noticed, wide shots from positions where I'd never stood, and most disturbing of all, aerial views of the scene taken from directly above the victim. I examined the aerial photographs more closely. They showed Chen's body from a perspective that would have required a camera position at least 100 feet above the ground. But there had been no helicopter at the scene, no elevated platform, no way for anyone to have taken photographs from that vantage point. The images were technically perfect. Proper exposure, sharp focus, professional composition. They appeared to have been shot with the same film stock I'd used, processed in the same chemicals, printed on the same paper, but I'd never taken them. I checked my processing log against the prints hanging on the line. The 12 images I documented were all there, exactly as I'd printed them. But the 15 additional photographs had no corresponding entries in my records, no negative numbers, no exposure notes, no documentation of when or how they'd been created. I called Detective Rodriguez, asking if anyone else had photographed the scene after I'd finished my documentation. She confirmed that no other photographers had been present, no aerial surveillance had been conducted, no additional evidence collection had occurred. But as I continued examining the mysterious prints, I found something that made my hands shake. The aerial photographs showed details that hadn't been visible from ground level. Footprints in the salt-crusted sand leading away from the body in multiple directions. Tire tracks from a vehicle that had approached the dump site from the east. Evidence of a struggle-disturbed sand. Scattered personal belongings that we'd missed during our initial investigation. More disturbing were the timestamps visible in some of the images. Several prints showed my own evidence markers in positions I didn't remember placing them. Others captured moments of the investigation that I had no memory of, shots of Rodriguez examining evidence we'd never found, images of myself photographing areas I'd never documented. I drove back to the crime scene that afternoon, telling myself I needed to verify what the photographs had shown. But when I arrived at the location, I found exactly the evidence the aerial images had revealed. The footprints were there, leading away from the body in patterns that suggested multiple people had been present when Chen died. The tire tracks were clearly visible once I knew where to look, pressed deep into the hardpan beneath a thin layer of wind-blown sand. Most disturbing was a piece of evidence we'd somehow overlooked during our initial search, a cell phone, partially buried about 20 feet from where the body had been found. The phone contained text messages that suggested Chen had been lured to the Salton Sea by someone he'd met online, someone who'd promised him information about a business opportunity. But according to my crime scene photographs, the ones that had developed themselves, this evidence had been documented during our original investigation. The images showed Rodriguez bagging the phone, showed me photographing the tire tracks, showed a thorough search that had never actually occurred. I returned to the darkroom that evening to process new film from my second visit to the scene. I shot one roll, documenting the evidence we'd missed, following the same systematic approach I always used. When I developed the film and made prints, I found something that forced me to question everything I thought I understood about photography. The images from my second visit to the scene showed the crime scene, as it had appeared during our first investigation, before we'd found the additional evidence, before we'd disturbed the tire tracks, before we'd collected the cell phone. But mixed in with these photographs were images I'd never taken, showing the scene as it would appear days later. Crime scene tape removed, the sand disturbed by wind and weather, the location slowly returning to its natural state. I had somehow photographed the past and future of a crime scene using the same roll of film. I never mentioned the self-developing photographs in my official report. The case was eventually ruled a homicide based on the evidence we'd collected during our second search, and the killer was identified through the victim's cell phone records. Chen had been murdered for the $15,000 in cash he'd been carrying, money that was never recovered. But I kept those impossible photographs locked in my desk drawer, along with the negatives that should never have existed. Sometimes I take them out and study them, trying to understand how a darkroom can develop images that were never exposed, how chemicals can create prints from light that was never captured. I've stopped using the darkroom for official work. The department finally convinced me to switch to digital photography, claiming it's more efficient and reliable. But sometimes I wonder what other photographs might be developing themselves in that basement room. What other scenes might be documenting themselves when no one is watching? The chemicals don't care about time or causality. They just reveal whatever light has touched the film, even if that light comes from moments that haven't happened yet, or angles that shouldn't exist. Film remembers everything, even the things we forget to photograph.